you so much. Oh, wow. Yeah, let's give a round of applause for Casey Parks. This is going to be fun. My name's Anneliese Singh. I use she and they pronouns. We have chairs in the front, so come on up front if you're coming in now. I serve as Tulane's Chief Diversity Officer. I'm from New Orleans, and I'm a Tulane alum. And before I introduce Casey, can we just kind of say how much we love queer and trans people? Let's just say that together. 1, 2, 3. We love queer and trans people. Now, does anyone actually have to scream right now? Let's do that. 1, 2, 3. Ah! Is this like the first time this has ever happened?
Yeah, no, I haven't had any screaming at any of my other events, good or bad screaming. So
I think we've had a little stress building up in our bodies, and so yeah, it's just good to be with community. Thank you all so much for coming out today, and thank you. Welcome home, Casey.
Thank you.
I want to read your bio because it's not a long one, but you know it feels important. Casey Parks is a reporter for the Washington Post who covers gender and family issues. She was previously a staff reporter at the Jackson, Mississippi Free Press and spent a decade at the Oregonian, where she wrote about race and LGBTQ plus issues, was a finalist for the Livingston Award. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, New Yorker, Oxford American, U.S. Today and The Nation, a former Spencer Fellow at Columbia University. Parks most recently received the 2021 J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award for Diary of a Misfit. Parker lives in Portland, Oregon. Was that brief enough? I know you don't like the long ones, right?
I had an event the other day and the bio was like 10 minutes long. I was like, this is embarrassing.
It's always awkward. First of all, I just want to thank you. I mean, if you haven't read this book, please go get it. I mean, I told Casey I'm going to try not to tear up as I talk with you today.
I cried the whole time I wrote it. So
well, you know, we did read that. Okay, so we have permission to drop some tears here. As someone raised in the South, as someone who identifies as a mixed race, South Asian, queer, genderqueer, femme person, whose mom died recently, who I feel like I was raised up in New Orleans by queer and trans communities of color. Your book was so deeply meaningful to me, so I just wanted to thank you. But for our folks here, can you tell us a little bit about what your book is about?
Yeah, this is probably my worst skill. It's a wonder I got a book deal, because I always struggle to explain what it's about, because I sometimes will say it's a fruit salad of every Southern issue, because there's just like a ton of stuff that goes on in there, which is it's difficult for selling a book, I guess. But essentially, 21 years ago on Easter Sunday in church, I told my mom I was gay, and after she asked if I wanted to go to the altar and get healed, she she was initially okay with it, actually, because she took me to Walmart and just bought me like the most giant box of tampons I've ever seen. I don't know if she was just thinking like vaginally.
Yeah, you're like, thanks, Mom.
That was her way of supporting me at the time. But then once she got over the high of the tampons, she really turned against me, and she outed me to everybody at my college. She called the president, she called all my professors, and she would send me letters pretty frequently telling me that thinking of me made her want to throw up. So I went home for the summer to, I think my best friend is already crying. The first person ever I told I was gay is in the audience.
I
so
love it.
Huge, and she responded well. So it did give me the strength to tell my mom. But so I went home for the summer to try to prove I wasn't evil, and kind of on 4th of July, we were having like a big barbecue, and my uncle was staring at me over the meat and said, this is actually the secret. This was my beginning for a long time, and it never worked. And then finally a friend of mine told me, she was like, this is not a book about your uncle. So little tip, if you're writing a book, the first sentence should be what your book is about, I guess. But so if it's not about your uncle, don't make the first sentence about your uncle. And he looked at me and he was like, have you ever heard of Sodom and Gomorrah? And I was like, I'm alive in North Louisiana. Yes, I've heard of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he said, God destroyed a whole nation to get rid of homosexuality. What makes you think he won't destroy you? And my mom ran to the bathroom and was crying. And I went into the bathroom with her. And at the time I told her, I was like, okay, I'm not going to be gay anymore. Because she told me she thought she was going to lose her job because I was gay. And my family was really poor, so I knew we couldn't afford for her to lose her job. And as I was like promising her that I would go on a date with Richard from Blockbuster, my
That's
grandma.
a really good part of the book, actually.
Thank you. And he was like 6'5", which I thought like the taller the man you got, the straighter you were. But he also like had a very feminine face and long hair, so he was kind of a gateway back to gay. But with apologies to Richard wherever he may be.
Was he one of the ones that you brought to prom that was also queer?
No,
we were talking earlier
my
about...
prom date is also
Yeah.
here.
Oh, that's right. I mean, raise your hand if you brought your fellow queer brethren to prom in high school. Yes, we did that. Good times.
But right as I was promising my mom that, my grandma stormed in and told my mom basically to quit crying. And she said, life is a buffet. Some people eat hot dogs and some people eat fish. And
So awkward. So awkward.
I was telling this story in Jackson, Mississippi a few nights ago, and unbidden, I just started thinking of my grandma having sex after that. And I was just like, please make it stop. But I'm not going to think about that right now.
But you're reminding me, when I clued my mom into my gender and sexuality, she was like, well, sweetie, there was this one time I had a massage from a woman. And her eyes just kind of glazed over. I was like, no!
Oh.
They steal our moments sometimes, right? And these are big moments.
Oh man, I want that to
I
be
know.
my other
but
book,
I-
your mom's massage.
Things I don't want to be thinking about. Yeah.
So after my grandma gave her big hot dog fish metaphor, she pulled me aside, and this is 2002. So the only gay people I knew were Ellen DeGeneres and Elton John. Not personally, but well, the only out gay people I knew. It turned out I knew quite a few gay people. They just hadn't come around to tell me yet. But and I didn't really know any trans people. I think this was like a couple years before Chaz Bono. And my grandma just looked at me and said, I had just cut all my hair off because I don't know why I thought I was going to go home and prove I might be straight, because I had just given myself a buzz cut. But she kind of looked at my buzz cut and said, I grew up across the street from a woman who lived as a man.
Oof. Okay.
And I was like, what? And I remember that was so innocent. I asked her, did they tar and feather this person in the center of town? And she was just like, no, everybody loved him. And I just could not imagine that at all, because after I'd come out, my pastor went in front of our whole church and prayed, save her and take her. So the idea was that I was like supposed to ask forgiveness for being gay and then die right there in the altar. So this idea that there was this place where everyone accepted the local trans guy, it just blew my mind. And my grandma told me that she said there was this kidnapping mystery, and then she told me that he had once been the most important person in her life, but she lost touch with him. And so she wanted me to go to her hometown, which is like 1,000 people, just pretty much farms. And I did find out they now have 2 stoplights this week. But at the time, there was 1 stoplight, no restaurants. So she said, I want you to go to town and like find out what happened to Roy. And
Because there was a bathtub confession.
there was a
right?
bathtub,
She'd gone
yeah. So
across the
she told me.
street.
So my grandma, Roy, was this guy who was like the local country music star. He played like Hank Williams covers, and he wrote his own songs. He played the banjo on the porch every night. And I think my grandma had a little bit of a crush on him, and she just thought of him as a guy. And then when his mother died, or the person that my grandmother thought was his mother, she called my great-grandma across the street. She was like in a bathtub full of alcohol, and she pulled my great-grandma like down into the bathtub, and she said, Rita Mae, Roy is as much a woman as you or I ever was.
Wow.
And then she said that she had stolen him when he was a little girl from an abusive family, and then raised him as a boy to like evade detection. And so my grandmother wanted to find out if that was true. And so initially I was like, okay, I'll go to town and like load a spool of microfiche, and I'm gonna find the article that's like, baby stolen, here's all the information, Casey, that you want. And that article didn't exist, and because it turns out newspapers from that time are just really about like which rich white person visited which other rich white person. And I mean, I don't know if anyone in here is a historian, but it can be really hard to write about people who were not powerful or white or straight because they didn't really make the news. And
he mowed lawns, right?
He mowed lawns. Yeah, he just mowed lawns for a living when he wasn't playing the banjo. So I had thought it would take me like 2 to 3 visits to make this.
And that
I
didn't
initially
happen.
wanted to make it as like an application for This American Life, but they never contacted me back.
Well, you had aspirations, and I'm glad you did, right? Because you wanted to be a journalist, and here you are doing that, right? So
Yeah, I wasn't actually a journalist yet, but I knew I wanted to be one because my friends and I over here had worked on the high school newspaper together. Please do not ask them about my articles at the time.
afterwards, we have a Q&A session, by the way. We have 10 minutes at the end.
When I did get married, the person who did my ceremony interviewed my friends for the ceremony, and this friend told him my first article was about what a superb actor Bruce Willis was.
Oh, great.
So now I guess
That's what friends are for, actually.
So it wound up taking me 20 years, not 3 visits to do. But the book is about all the trips that I take home to learn about Roy, and my own family winds up joining the mystery hunt, and it's about our relationships as we try to learn about Roy.
Yeah, and there's so many things.
This is why I have trouble.
Yes, totally. Well, I mean, there's so many themes in the book. I mean, seriously, get it. I mean, it's a story of, I think, redemption in some ways, of home, of grief and loss, of gender, of so many things, of connection. And you said 18 to 20 years. I mean, it took you to do this project. It was going to be, I think, a documentary at first. Maybe there was going to be a podcast, maybe an article. It ended up as a book. And your grandma said, after some time, maybe you should just leave this alone. Leave it alone with Roy. But you couldn't. Can you talk a little bit of why you couldn't leave it alone? And then why a book? Because it was going to be so many different other things.
Oh, yeah. Well, it turns out I'm better at writing than all the other things. But
Okay.
it's so hard to answer, why something compels you. And I don't think I really knew for a long time. It's true, when I was 18, I did not know other queer people. And so the idea that Roy existed just, really buoyed me. To think there is a historical context for me. We have existed and lived, and not just in, L.A. or England or wherever Elton John lived. I'm not a geography person, but
We've got some seats up front and over here, too.
so to find out that someone like me existed in this rural town just really rocked my world, and I wanted to know how did you live and survive? Because at that point at 18, I really didn't know how I was going to live and survive. The only person I had to support me was Liz, and everyone else, as far as I knew, wanted me to die and try to go to heaven immediately. And so I think initially it compelled me because I just wanted to know that I had a past and a future.
Yeah.
And over time, I wound up moving to Portland, Oregon, which is the Xanadu of lesbianism. You really, just so many.
There's so many things in what you just said. Lots of flannel.
So much flannel, so many shaved heads, so many bad tattoos. But there were about, there's one part in the book where I was trying to find a girlfriend, and there was only one gay dating site at the time. It was called Planet Out, and it cost $40, which I couldn't afford.
That's expensive.
And it's so expensive. And so if you couldn't pay the money, they would just show you the blurred photos from your region. And at the time, the region for my town was the entire South, and there were just 6 blurry women. And I would try to figure out how I can make one of those blurry women my girlfriend. But in Portland, there's probably 6 lesbians living in my building. Oh
yeah, yeah.
So
Very
it opened
different.
up things. So I didn't need Roy in that same way to be
Right.
this is the only queer person that I've ever heard of. But then I think I came to need this story as an excuse to go home, because when I initially left the South, I just felt so happy to leave. I was I'm going to go where Slater Kinney lives, and
You're I'm out of here.
I just wanted to not be thinking about my gayness all the time and just be and know other people. But the longer I lived in Portland, the more it also didn't feel like home, and I started to miss these brown pine trees and the way the
smell in the air
the
you
air,
talk
yeah.
about, yeah.
We drove around last night and we're just do you smell that?
Some of it you don't want to smell,
But I
yes.
do. I want to smell every gross thing right now. And I almost didn't want to go to sleep because we were just sitting outside smelling,
Yeah.
And Oregon doesn't really smell like anything.
Yeah.
And when I
it's
first
clean.
moved there, I was
It's very
excited.
clean.
It's very clean in Oregon, but after a while, you miss dirtiness.
Yeah.
So I think it gave me. I felt compelled because it gave me a reason to come home. And it gave me something to talk about with my family, because I was just very scared to talk to my family about myself. And so we would be talking about Roy, but we'd really be talking about each other a lot of times.
Right. Well, and I'd asked you if you could read page 20, 21. It's a longer passage, but I really want, if you haven't read the book, I really want you to be able to hear the words. And, you know, this passage meant a lot to me, and the book did as well. My mom was born and raised in Monroe, Louisiana, but just, you know, the reckoning you have with your own journey, with your gender, just what you want in life, your profession, I think, and why you wrote the book, I think.
Okay.
It's a longer passage.
I have never read this out loud before, so if I stutter, actually when I was in college, I used to beg my professors never to make me read out loud, so I don't know why I've taken...
Do you want me to read it?
No, it's okay. I'll
try.
try.
I did get consent beforehand.
But if I mess up, y'all forgive me. Okay, so just a really quick background. On my first trip there, someone told me that Roy kept a diary every day of his life and that his neighbors had them all. And for 10 years, I would ask this neighbor if I could see the diaries, and for 10 years, he said no. And so right before what I'm about to read, he asked me why I was doing it, why I wanted to do this project. I think this is about 8 or 9 years in, and he's like, why do you keep coming to my trailer and bothering me? So here's why. My legs shook. I wanted to tell Mark why I kept returning. Maybe he wouldn't even care that I was a lesbian. After all, his brother Keith, the man who'd taken my mother and me to see Roy's tombstone 4 years earlier, was gay. Maybe Mark already suspected that's why I was interested in Roy. But I hadn't even articulated that connection to myself, so I stuttered as I tried to explain what about Roy's life interested me. Watching the video now, I taped everything, so to write this book, I had to rewatch my 20-something self. Watching the video now, I can see that I was just starting to piece together my own role in the project. I definitely have no interest in portraying Roy in a bad light, I said. My grandmother told me about this when I was a teenager. I'm about to be 30 now, so that's 12 years. I said a few mumbled words that didn't add up to a sentence. I almost hoped Mark would interrupt me, but he didn't. I have never wanted to be a man or dress as a man. This is just what I said. I do think I like to dress as a man, but I think I was scared to tell him that. But I felt different growing up in Monroe. My grandmother told me that everybody in town loved Roy. I don't think that's as true as she wanted to believe it was, but I think she told me that because it was her way of accepting me and showing me that she grew up somewhere where people are different. At the time, it was really antithetical to what I thought about Louisiana. I thought everybody would bully you if you were any kind of different. I couldn't believe there was a place where you could be different and people would love you and accept you. That's really how I got started on it. I took a deep breath. Telling Mark I felt different was as close to coming out as I'd ever done in Delhi. I searched his face for some sign of judgment, but I didn't see any. My legs started to shake a little less, and my voice grew more confident. Ultimately, the longer I've worked on it, the more I've wanted to show that Roy was a complete person. Not just show that Roy was a woman who dressed as a man. To me, at the end of the day, that's the least interesting part. That one thing can't be a whole person's life. The more interesting part is Roy playing music or riding a bicycle or working. I just want to find things that make Roy a real human and not just limited to one tiny thing, because people aren't that way. They have hopes and dreams and feelings and interests and annoyances. I was sputtering out. 2 birds were fighting over a worm mid-air right next to me, and they were squawking so loud it distracted me. I wanted to tell Mark that everyone I'd interviewed seemed to remember Roy as some kind of victim or novelty. One woman actually said that to me. She was like, "We just thought he was a novelty." She was like, he wasn't the only novelty. There was a woman with the big goiter. And
like, what do these things have to do with it?
And then another man that they just called Big Boy because he was too big to fit in his own car. I wanted them to remember Roy as a person. I didn't get the words out right, but he seemed to understand what I meant.
Okay, like my eyes were leaking. I don't know if yours were. Just thank you. I mean, it's such a gift. I told you I was probably going to cry, but I think the book is so meaningful. And I want to read another passage. Hopefully y'all felt the power of Casey's words, but I just have been thinking recently about like what we lose when we don't hear and read and can access queer and trans, especially Southern stories, right? And especially with all the attacks that are on queer and trans lives, and the parts of queer and trans community that are the most vulnerable, right? You say on page 348 through the end of the book, I don't think this will spoil anything. This is back to Mark. Mark said, one thing about Royce, the way he was treated by some people and the way his life went, society was robbed of potential. How many potentials does our society rob by bullying and treating people like Roy was treated? Roy could have been a nurse. He could have been, for all I know, a journalist because of the way he loved to write. That's sad, isn't it? So I wondered if you could comment on that. I know as a journalist, you can't comment on all the accoutrements and nitty-gritty pieces of legislation and things like that. But in terms of what do we lose when there are these types of attacks on our communities?
Yeah, well, with Roy specifically, as Mark said, he did love to write and he played music, and some of it was also just poverty. He had no connections to know how to get his music out in the world, and that is one thing that really motivated me to want to see his journals. Is I was like, this guy actually kept his own story for years and years, and I don't actually have to be the one to tell it. I can't write a book where I tell his whole story when he has told it, and I want that to be out in the world. But he, I don't know if he was nervous to put his life story out in the world at that time, or if he just didn't have the connections to. But consequently, he just mowed lawns, and this essential piece of queer history would be lost if I didn't just keep knocking on this trailer door for 11 years. And there's probably lots of people like that. Sometimes at my job at the Washington Post now, I mostly cover trans issues, and people will leave comments like, "Oh, well, we had a neighbor like this 75 years ago in rural Texas," and there's tons of Roys who existed, and we just don't know because the internet didn't exist, and the forces of power saw to it that we didn't get those stories. And I think you see this even to a greater extent now, where the trans suicide attempt rate is 44%, yeah. And we might not forget doing something crazy special, we might just not even have those lives. And I was saying I'm really introverted, and my friend that's staying with me is really extroverted and was playing Beyonce's Renaissance full blast all morning.
Yes,
and we would not have Beyonce's Renaissance. I mean, everything that's on Renaissance is from queer and trans people, and there's so much of, well, we wouldn't have jumpsuits. I know straight women love to wear jumpsuits now, but that is ours. We wouldn't have Spill the Tea. We wouldn't have anything good, at all, pretty much.
Exactly. Hello. Can we say it one more time? We love queer and trans community. 1, 2, 3.
We love queer and trans community.
I just want to bring the love back, because I think when I think my own work has been kind of researching queer and trans identity, resilience, liberation, resistance, and I always come back to history, her story, and I say T story, trans story. People think, Roy was a trend or a fad, or, non-binary folks. Oh my gosh, there's so many of them. At Tulane, our rates of our admission of queer and trans students this past year was 17%. That's really higher than
wow.
when, I know, and some people are like, that's all those non-binary folks, right? They don't know themselves, right? But I'm getting really excited about our non-binary communities who are reclaiming themselves, because if we look pre-colonization, right, anti-Black racism and forms of enslavement, indigenous erasure. Queer and trans folks, we've always been here, right? And
there's also, Hawaiian culture, the
Mahu.
Yeah, they were the most special people. Same with the Hijira.
The Hijra in India,
yeah,
where
there's
my family was.
Yeah, there's so many communities where not only were they accepted, they were special.
Sacred.
Yeah,
the
they were
Two-Spirit,
yeah, they were these are the people we go to. Yeah,
the continent of Africa. So I think it's one of the reasons I really appreciated your book too, because you're not only writing Roy back into history, or we could say T story, but it makes me think about how important it is to tell our stories. I want to make sure we have some time for questions, but I have a couple of other ones for you. Can you talk about your mom? I know that this is a huge part of the book.
Yeah.
We got 8 minutes to do that. A friend up here is like, oh yeah. I think moms have really interesting roles in our lives as queer and trans folks, especially in the South. So tell me.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if I could find it really quickly.
Yeah.
There's one part about my mom that I think kind of sums her up. That I don't know if I can read it without crying, but let's try.
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, and while you're looking for it, I think it's one of the things I appreciated about your book is that you didn't mythologize any of the quote unquote characters or the people, the real people that were in the book. You know, they showed up in all of their gifts and their flaws.
So my mom was crazy smart, which she never let me forget. Her favorite word was mellifluous, and which she would say about her own voice.
That's hilarious.
She was very charismatic. She struggled with a lot of mental health problems. Her boyfriend in high school died by suicide, and at his funeral, an oak tree fell on her head and knocked her unconscious. And while she was in the hospital, they gave her her first Percocet, and she also saw the 700 Club for the first time. And
not a good mix.
Percocet and the 700 Club really kind of defined the rest of her life. And a couple of weeks later, she met my dad and got pregnant. And because of that, in 1982 in Louisiana, ULM would not let her go to college because she was pregnant and not yet married. So she never got to go to college. And she just struggled a lot, but she could also be a really awesome, supportive person. If anyone out in society wronged one of my friends, she was the first person to call and complain and wage a war against them. But she was hard, and she let me down a lot, and she could be really abusive. And so I'll read this little thing, and hopefully I won't cry. Looking back, the highs and lows all mixed together, so I can't remember exactly when she was Juan and when she was my mother. I know my mom screamed at me in front of the trailer that if my dad divorced her, it would be my fault. I know she took a nighttime cleaning job so she could buy me a pair of Jabot jeans and brown six-eyed Doc Martens. Someone gave her a computer and an AOL free trial, and she spent weeks or months ignoring me while she chatted with a man in California. She climbed into my bed in the middle of the night and told me she hated me. She whispered it wet and low, then she left me there crying alone. She sang Eric Clapton's Wonderful Tonight, using a hairbrush as a microphone as I got ready for my first middle school dance. She beat me with a wooden spoon. She kicked down my bedroom door, and my brother and I called her Hurricane Rhonda, a force of nature no God could stop. She taught me how to drive. She let me skip school to cry with her after Princess Diana died, and she bought me a tape of Elton John's updated version of Candle in the Wind. I sang along, sometimes picturing Princess Di, sometimes thinking about my mother. I worried my mom would die young if she didn't stop using the nose spray. It was an opioid nose spray she liked to use. She told me she took Stadol to ease her headaches, and I believed her because I had no other options. Back then, we never said the word opioid. There was no pharmaceutical company to blame, no worldwide epidemic that allowed me to contextualize my mom's addiction. There was only my mother, bright and joyous when she was off the nose spray, vacant and mean when she was on. I think she stayed alert for most of my freshman year of high school because I remember her taking me to Waffle House to talk about my first kiss, and I know she put 2 gowns on layaway at JCPenney so we could dress up to see what she told me was the premiere of Titanic. At 14, I was naive enough to believe that James Cameron had staged a party in Monroe, Louisiana, and I was so excited to be spending time with my mom that I didn't complain when we arrived and found that no one else had dressed up. We stayed out late that night talking about how cute Leonardo DiCaprio was, and I didn't think about Tony, which was a girl, a single time that winter.
And you dedicated the book to your mom.
Yeah. I dedicated it to my grandma and my
And your
mom.
yeah.
My grandma used to always tell me to stay out of the meanness. So it says, for Wanda Louise, who taught me to stay out of the meanness, and for Rhonda Jean, who always jumped right in. My mom liked to be in the meanness, for good or bad.
I just love hearing you read your words because I always kind of feel like I'm on a porch and we're in some rocking chairs, as I'm reading.
If
your
y'all
words.
do like my voice, there's a 15-hour audio book. If you got 15 hours.
Rock away. But yeah, you can hear the longing for your mom and the connections at time and the disconnections. So what was that like to revisit as you were writing? Because you're writing during the pandemic. Everything's shut down. It's 2020.
And I had never been to therapy before.
Oh, that's right. Didn't you go to therapy when you were writing the last chapters of the book?
Yeah, I needed therapy to
I'm a
write the
therapist, y'all,
last.
so I value therapy.
Yeah, I had. There came a time where I could not write the final 3 chapters, and I was like, well, shit, I guess I have to go to therapy. Yeah, it was really hard because there were a lot of things in there. I was married at the time when I wrote the book, and there were a lot of things in there I hadn't told my spouse. A lot of things I hadn't told my best friends. And it helped to, I was talking to my best friend, I don't know, all day, every day of the pandemic, and that helped to start to bring some of this out. But it was very painful because I had just, when I left Louisiana, I really walled myself up, and I was like, this place will not touch me. I will not let this place hurt me. I'm leaving, and I'm never thinking about this place again. I got myself a crazy haircut, and I just, I wore mismatched socks and earrings, and I was just like, I'm going to be as weird as possible, and nothing can touch me. And, for a long time that worked. I thought I was tough and not hurting, but it comes out the edges.
Your mom did the same thing in different ways, right?
Yeah.
She put on a mask to she became a warrior to deal with so much of what she was encountering.
And sometimes I think you have to do that to survive, but I do think it eventually catches up with you. And, I would let myself feel it a little bit on the trips, and then I'd close myself off again when I went home. And then when I sat down to write this, I had all this video footage. And at that point, my mom was dead, and I couldn't ask her anything. And it was just so painful. And I think partially why I had to get therapy to do the last 3 chapters is because I knew when I finished it, I was going to turn off my hard drive and turn off the video, and she would be really dead. Because since I was writing this in the pandemic, I was watching video of her, which is the way everyone existed to me.
Right.
And so it was almost as if she were alive again. And I would, a lot of my book writing process was just sitting at my computer crying, usually with 3 cats around me, just crying into the cats.
Perfect.
Very lesbian.
Perfect lesbian stereotype. Yes.
And, when it came out and was out in the world and I had to read stuff like that, I was in a really bad mental breakdown, but then I got a good therapist. So,
and that is always amazing.
So I'm in a better place now, but I think I did have to excavate and process a lot of it to be able to live the rest of my life.
Well, and not to be silly, I think when we are at Pride and we see PFLAG come by, we're always crying, right? Because we're longing for that acceptance, for that support. So I just appreciated you writing about the truth of that all. So we are at our Q&A. I've got plenty of other questions, but I do want to make sure to prioritize your voices. We do have a mic in the middle of the room. That's really important for the recording. So, and can we just give a round of applause to Casey Parks? Holy shit. Amazing. So any questions that we have that you might want to share kind of what your experience of reading the book was. And of course we may want to hear from the high school friends about some extra Casey stories. Yes. If you could share your name, your pronouns, and
I'm Nick, he, him. I'm also gay. I'm from Louisiana, from the North Shore.
Yes.
And I was wondering, I haven't read your book yet. I'm about to go buy it right now. But I was wondering if you had advice for people who are dealing with internalized homophobia.
Ooh.
That's a good one. Because that's, I wrote down an Alok quote. Maybe I'll give you a second to respond. If y'all don't know Alok, run out and follow them on all the things social media, South Asian, non-binary person. It's not that you internalize the shame, rather it becomes you. You no longer need to be surveilled at school or someone telling you at school not to dress like that. You already do this to yourself.
Wow. That, it's so interesting. I think for so much of my life, I'm I would never be straight. I'm I do not like beards. I do not understand how women kiss men. Y'all are gross to me. Sorry. I see you have a beard. I love gay friendships. I love, I have a few token straights in my life, but I really try to minimize y'all in my existence. And yet, there are so many things I do that is still in the shame of being gay. Even when my brother got married, I had a little break just a couple years ago. I was oh my God, I look so gay. Everyone was going to see me and see I look gay. And even actually looking in the mirror this morning, I almost asked my friend to put makeup on me, which I have never do, but I was just oh my God, I look so gay. Or I hide it, I had, I wrote about these teenagers from rural Mississippi for the New York Times, and they came to all my Mississippi events. They drove I don't know, 10 hours over the course of 2 days to see me.
That's awesome.
And they showed up to surprise me, and my first thought was, oh my God, they're going to find out I'm gay. I'm about to read about kissing a woman in front of them. And it is forever, I guess, even though in my heart I'm like, there's no way I want to be straight. I have zero interest in straightness. I don't know how I guess you just keep pushing back against yourself and try to be gentle with yourself, and but it takes so much bravery, and I guess you're right. You just internalize that. And
for what it's
sorry,
worth,
this is not hopeful
no,
at all.
I mean, I think it's true. It's the truth we need to talk about. And I think just one thing about my own experience where I think maybe I don't struggle with that piece as much is that I grew up in the faith of Sikhism, which is I am not a sin. I am not a sinner. It's like all the good news. And so as I clued into my gender and sexuality, I wasn't carrying that piece. And so I don't know how that fits in, but we've got a line. So name,
Some
pronouns,
of it is
we got a question.
fear, I think.
Yeah, fear.
Hi, we have a transgender son.
Yay,
woohoo! Who is very fortunate to have incredible parents and grandparents and extended family who have been very supportive from the day one that this was brought to our attention a couple of years ago. He lived in New Orleans for 10 years, about 5 blocks away from us, and he and his sister were just a huge part of our life while they lived here, and then they moved to Philadelphia almost 4 years ago. And our relationship has become much more distant, and when we're together, which is probably about 4 times a year, I'm trying to figure out what the best way is to communicate with him, what's comfortable to talk about. We want to be as supportive as we can, and we love him to death. He is very anti-South right now. He had 10 years. He's applying he's gotten into 5 universities for next year, 2 in Oregon and Washington State and Vermont.
We'll send him my way if he does. Yeah. Well, first of all, just amazing. Thank you for being here, and thank you for, I hope that you can say that to your friends so that it spreads and people know. I think for me, a lot of my family actually did support me, and in my mind, I thought they didn't. And I found out more when my book came out, and they all bought it that day, and they were telling me how proud they were and asking me about who I was dating and stuff. But I think the main reason that I was afraid they didn't is they never asked me questions. I would go sit with my grandma doing this book, and she would ask me who my brother was dating, who my cousin was dating, and she would never ask me. She would never ask me about my friends. They would make little comments about how Portland is always on fire because it's, it likes to make Fox News. And those little things just kind of ate at me. Not saying that you're doing that, but I think if they had ever, the times when I feel most connected to my family is when my aunt asks me about girls I'm dating, or she's like, ooh, she's cute, or or just, I guess there's so many things that are just a whole culture that have nothing even to do with kissing or sex, movies that I like or bands that I like that my family, I remember my mom used to always make fun of Nico Case's voice all the time, and it just made me feel well, you don't understand me at all. And I think if any times you can just show interest, or I don't know if he reads books or books that you liked. And, it's hard because you got to walk a thin line where you don't sound like you're trying too hard and being stereotypical. You could join PFLAG and be a PFLAGer parent. Maybe you already are, but yeah. But there is a weird line where you're okay, I don't want to hear about the one trans person you met, or, you heard
about our awkward stories already.
But I think just try to be genuine and also not take it personally that he hates the South, because I do think that's part of the process, and he'll probably come back around, but it's probably self-preservation to hate the South right now. And as cold as it is, Philly's very cool. A lot of attractive women there, in my humble opinion. It's really my type of woman, mullet, dirty, kind of.
Well, and get him this book, I think.
Yeah.
Another thing I would say. Thank you for your question. Yeah.
I'm Aether Arcana, and I just turned 18. Well, I'm about to turn 18. I didn't think I was going to make it this long. And seeing older queer and trans people, I didn't think that we got to live very long. I saw someone who was a trans man with gray hair the other day, and I'm sorry, I'm going to get emotional. And I was surprised that we get to live that long, and I don't know if you ever had that experience, but I don't really know how to deal with it because I didn't plan this far.
Wow. Well, I'm so glad that you did make it so long, and I hope that you don't have to buy a book, but I hope you'll come up to the signing thing so I can talk to you more.
That'll be at 1:15 down that way.
I just, a 90-year-old lesbian read my book, and she contacts me every day, and I love talking to her because I'm just like, oh my God. Like, she was with her partner for 65 years, and they stayed in the closet until the other one died, and this woman came out at her funeral by saying the best day of her life was the day this woman took her in her arms and made love to her. She said that at the funeral.
Hell yeah.
And it's the same thing where I just look up to her so much. I'm like, oh my God, we've existed this long and we can love for 65 years. I just recently got divorced, and my ex and I are really great friends, but like I do sometimes, it's scary. Like, can we have real existing love the way straight people did? Can we keep existing that way? And I think you got to find you some queer elders to be in your life, and like join some groups or clubs, or find them online, or like, I don't know how elder I am. I guess I am. I do.
We're elders
yeah,
now.
I do have gray hair. I'm about to turn 40, but I'm happy to be that. I'm happy to stay in touch. But thank you so much for sharing that. It's really beautiful. And
Well, and our queer and trans sisters, I mean, the one thing they've wanted from generation to generation is for us to live. And so I think finding those pockets of what that means for each of us is so important.
my therapist is like a 57-year-old lesbian, and
hell yeah.
I think a big part of my therapy is just seeing her and asking, like, how did you survive? How did you do this? And just looking at her. I mean, she's been with her partner 20 years, and it does give me a lot of hope, and like thinking like, okay, well, you probably met her at 37, so there's still time for me, and like, so I think just getting those people in your life is huge, even if it's someone you pay.
We've got a minute and a half.
Hi.
Well, he said we actually get 2 secret minutes after this, so we're going to do both
we
of these
do?
questions. Yeah.
Hi.
No, we don't.
My name is
Sorry.
Maddie. I use she, they pronouns. I'm also gay and from the South, the Dirty Dell, Slidell. And it's also a place that actively wants me to not be around. So hearing everything you say, just I sat next to your friend. I turned to your friend. I said, "That's me. That's me." But what I want to ask is, I would just love to hear anything you have to say about your opinions on progressive spaces and queer spaces and people who discount the South and discount progressive and queer people from the South and view it as this place where any progress and liberation goes to die. Because obviously we feel that on an internal level because that's what happens to us here, but discounting...
You mean like Portland type places that look down on the South?
Right, yeah. Like when people
they're all white.
view the South as a place where there's no hope. There's no hope to try and make things
Yes.
better.
Well,
even
a
though
friend of
that's our
mine is
home.
from Mississippi too and lives in Portland, and I was like, what if we just all moved back? Like, enough of us have left. What if we had never left and stayed and built that? I think that's a huge part of it, is building that community yourself and being out loud about it. I was on a panel recently with somebody who did made a collective book called Y'all Means All, that's all Appalachian queer stories, I think, supporting that kind of thing. And just starting those clubs yourself. Who cares what Portland thinks of you? Don't let them think of you. I mean, you don't have to think about Portland, and they don't have to think about you. Like, they don't have a bearing on you. But I've been guilty of this myself. Probably my favorite part of the book is I was in Mississippi the day they passed this very onerous bill that they could kick you out of anywhere just for being gay. Like, doctors didn't have to treat you if they didn't want to. And I went up to these lesbians, and I was like, why don't y'all leave? Like, Portland is lesbian Xanadu. Like, you could have a better life. And she just looked at me and said, fuck that. I get to have my state. And they have to take me. And I remember being so jealous of her. And I think that's probably the moment for me where, like, a lot of the book came together, where I was like, what if I had thought I get to have my state?
And Casey Parks, you are a queer Southern gift, but to be respectful for the next author, we have to
sorry,
end.
you
but
can ask me
Yes,
later
let's give a
then.
round of applause. Thank you, thank you, thank you. 1:15 is the book signing.